17 years after leaving her past behind, a woman returns to the zoo to reconnect with the wolf she once raised as a pup. But what she finds isn't just a reunion. It's a heartbreaking transformation that sparks an incredible journey of hope, healing, and redemption. Can she help the wolf rediscover its purpose? And in doing so, will she rediscover her own? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Sophie adjusted her camera strap, her fingers running over the familiar worn leather of her professional gear. Sunlight streamed through her kitchen window, catching the dust motes dancing above an old photo album spread out on the table. Her daughter Ellie's excited voice filled the room. "Mom, look! Is that really you with the wolf?" Ellie pointed to a faded photograph, her blue eyes wide with wonder. Sophie leaned over her shoulder, smiling at the image of her teenage self cradling a small gray bundle of fur. "That's Luna. She was just a pup when I volunteered at the zoo." Her heart warmed at the memory of those summer days, bottle-feeding the tiny wolf and watching her take her first wobbly steps. "She's beautiful," Ellie breathed, carefully turning the pages. "Can we go see her, please?" Sophie zipped up her camera bag, nodding. "That's exactly where we're headed today. I haven't seen Luna in years, but I bet she's still as magnificent as ever." The drive to the zoo felt like stepping back in time. Sophie pointed out familiar landmarks to Ellie as they walked the winding paths, sharing stories of her volunteering days. "See that bench? I used to eat lunch there every day watching the flamingos." "Did Luna ever try to eat your lunch?" Ellie giggled, skipping alongside her mother. "No, but she did steal my shoes once." Sophie laughed, remembering the playful pup's mischievous streak. As they approached the wolf enclosure, Sophie's heart beat faster. She could picture Luna's puppy days so clearly. The way she'd bound through the grass, pounce on leaves, and howl for attention whenever Sophie arrived for her shift. But when they reached the viewing area, Sophie stopped dead in her tracks. The enclosure seemed larger and emptier than she remembered. In the far corner, partially hidden by rocks, lay a gray wolf with graying fur around her muzzle. She was curled up tight, her back to the visitors, showing no interest in the world around her. "Is that Luna?" Ellie's voice was small, uncertain. Before Sophie could answer, a gentle voice spoke behind them. "You must be Sophie Miller. I'm Emily Brown, one of the keepers here." Sophie turned, struggling to find her voice. "What happened to her?" Emily's face softened with sympathy. "Luna lost her entire pack to a disease outbreak 5 years ago. She's been alone ever since. We've tried introducing other wolves, but—" Emily shook her head. "She just withdraws more." Sophie stared at the solitary figure, her chest tight with emotion. This couldn't be the same energetic pup who used to greet her with such enthusiasm. Yet there was no mistaking the distinctive mark on Luna's ear, a small notch that had been there since birth. "She doesn't even look up anymore when visitors come by," Emily continued softly. "It's like she's given up on connecting with anyone." Sophie stood frozen, her camera hanging forgotten at her side. She felt Ellie's small hand slip into hers, squeezing gently. The gap between her cherished memories and the harsh reality before her seemed impossible to bridge. Sophie and Ellie settled on a weathered wooden bench near Luna's enclosure. The contrast between the quiet space and the lively sounds from other exhibits was striking. Monkey chatter and bird calls filled the air around them, making Luna's silence even more noticeable. "When Luna was young," Sophie began, her eyes distant with memories, "she was the smartest wolf pup I'd ever seen. She figured out how to unzip my backpack to get her favorite toy." She smiled at Ellie. "And she loved to play hide-and-seek with enrichment treats. We'd hide them all over her enclosure, and she'd find every single one.
Ellie looked at the still figure in the corner. Did she like to run?
Oh, she was so fast. She'd race along the fence line, trying to keep up with me when I walked by. Sometimes she'd get the other wolves running too, like she was their leader, even as a pup. Emily approached them, clipboard in hand. She was different back then, she said softly. These days, she won't even touch the enrichment toys we leave for her. We've tried everything, new scents, puzzle feeders, even attempting to introduce her to other wolves. Emily sighed, shaking her head, but she just retreats further into herself. Sophie's heart sank. How long has she been like this? It's gotten worse over the past few years. Mr. Randall, he's our director now. He's considering moving her to a sanctuary, somewhere quiet, where she can just be. Emily's voice carried a note of defeat. Maybe that's what she needs. Sophie's throat tightened. If only she hadn't left. If only she'd stayed involved with the zoo. Maybe she could have helped Luna through losing her pack. The weight of guilt pressed heavy on her shoulders. We should probably head home, Sophie said finally, standing up. It's getting late. As they gathered their things, Ellie suddenly grabbed her mother's arm. Mom, look! Sophie turned. At the sound of her voice carrying across the enclosure, Luna's head had lifted slightly, her ear twitching in their direction. It was a tiny movement, but it was the first response they'd seen all day. Did you see that? Ellie whispered excitedly. Sophie stared at Luna, her heart racing. That small sign of awareness sparked something inside her. Determination, hope, maybe both. She couldn't walk away again, not when there might still be a chance to help. I'm coming back tomorrow, Sophie said firmly, squeezing Ellie's hand. We have to try. The morning sun cast long shadows across the zoo's empty pathways as Sophie and Ellie made their way to Luna's enclosure. Sophie clutched an old spiral notebook, its pages yellowed and dog-eared from years of use. The cover was decorated with faded wolf stickers and teenage doodles. I wrote down everything about Luna when I worked here, Sophie explained, settling onto the bench. She opened the notebook carefully, revealing detailed sketches and hastily scribbled observations. Look here, this was her favorite morning routine. Ellie leaned in, studying the neat columns of times and activities. You were really organized, Mom. I wanted to remember everything. Sophie traced her finger along a page. Every morning at 8:30 we do enrichment activities. Luna loved when I tapped different rhythms on the glass. It was like our special game. Sophie approached the viewing window, her heart pounding. Luna lay in her usual spot, head resting on her paws. Taking a deep breath, Sophie began speaking in a soft, steady voice. Hey there, old friend. Remember those summer mornings when we'd watch the sunrise together? You'd always wake up before everyone else. She continued talking, sharing memories written in her notebook, her voice gentle and warm. At first, Luna remained still, giving no indication she heard. But after several minutes, her ears twitched, turning slightly toward Sophie's voice. Sophie's hands trembled as she noticed the subtle change. Look, Mom, Ellie whispered excitedly. Encouraged, Sophie raised her hand to the glass. Tap, 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 tap. The familiar rhythm echoed softly. She repeated it, watching Luna intently. Luna's eyes, which had seemed so distant yesterday, now fixed on Sophie. There was something different in them, a glimmer of awareness, perhaps even recognition. Though she didn't move from her spot, her gaze remained steady on Sophie as she continued the gentle tapping. Hours passed as Sophie alternated between talking, tapping, and simply sitting quietly. The sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in deep oranges and pinks. We should head home, Sophie said finally, gathering their things.
It's getting late.
As they stood to leave, Luna did something unexpected. She rose slowly to her feet and took several cautious steps toward the glass. She didn't come all the way over, but she was closer than they'd seen her yet.
Can we come back tomorrow?
Ellie asked, hope filling her voice.
Of course we can,
Sophie promised, smiling as they walked away. This time, Luna didn't retreat to her corner but remained in her new spot, watching them leave. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees as Sophie and Ellie made their way down the familiar path to Luna's enclosure. In Sophie's hands was an old cassette player, its silver surface scratched from years of use. "What's that sound you used to make for Luna?" Ellie asked, skipping alongside her mother. "It was more of a lullaby, really," Sophie explained, running her thumb over the worn play button. "I used to hum it to her when she was anxious or couldn't sleep." As they approached the enclosure, Luna was in her usual spot, curled up in the far corner. But at the sound of their footsteps, her head lifted, ears perking forward as Sophie's voice carried across the space. "Hi, Luna," Sophie called softly. "I brought something special today." Sophie settled onto the bench near the viewing window and placed the cassette player beside her. With trembling fingers, she pressed play. A gentle humming filled the air. Younger Sophie's voice, recorded years ago, singing a simple melody that rose and fell like gentle waves. Luna's reaction was immediate. Her ears twitched, and she raised her head higher, eyes fixed on Sophie. Slowly, cautiously, she rose to her feet. Sophie began humming along with the recording, matching the gentle tune she'd created so many years ago. The dual melodies, one from the past, one from the present, blended together in the quiet afternoon air. Step by step, Luna moved closer to the glass. Her movements were hesitant but deliberate, each paw placed with care, as if testing uncertain ground. When she reached the edge of the enclosure, she tilted her head, listening intently to the familiar song. Ellie watched in wonder as Luna lowered her nose to the ground near the glass, pawing gently at the earth. It was a gesture Sophie remembered from Luna's puppy days, something she used to do when she was content and relaxed. "Look at her, Mom," Ellie whispered, her eyes wide with excitement. Sophie continued humming, her heart swelling as Luna remained by the glass. The wolf's body language had changed, her tail held slightly higher, her posture more relaxed than they'd seen since their first visit. As the day wore on and other visitors began heading toward the exits, Luna stayed near the enclosure's edge. She watched Sophie and Ellie with alert eyes, showing more engagement than she had in days. Sophie felt tears welling up in her eyes as she watched the change in Luna. For the first time since returning to the zoo, she felt real hope blooming in her chest. Luna was still in there, the playful, connected wolf she'd known. She just needed help finding her way back. "I think we can help her," Sophie said softly to Ellie, gathering their things as closing time approached. "I need to talk to Mr. Randall about some ideas." Luna remained at the edge of her enclosure, watching them intently as they prepared to leave. The sight filled Sophie with determination. She knew what she had to do next. Sophie shifted in the hard plastic chair outside Mr. Randall's office, her fingers tracing the edges of an old photo album. Through the glass walls, she could see the zoo director on the phone, his brow furrowed in concentration. The waiting area smelled of coffee and printer paper, a stark contrast to the earthy scents of the animal enclosures. She opened the album to a page marked with a yellow sticky note. There was Luna as a pup, her gray fur fuzzy and her eyes bright with curiosity. Sophie had documented every milestone: Luna's first successful hunt training, her integration with the pack, the day she showed leadership qualities by mediating a dispute between two other wolves. Mr. Randall's door opened. "Ms. Miller, please come in." Sophie gathered her materials and stepped into his office. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the many framed certificates and awards on the walls. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me," Sophie said, settling into a chair across from his desk. Mr. Randall leaned back, his expression tired but polite. "Emily mentioned you've been visiting Luna. She also said you used to work with her?" "Yes, I was a volunteer when she first arrived." Sophie opened her album. "I kept detailed records of her progress and behaviors." Mr. Randall sighed, removing his glasses to rub his eyes. "Look, Ms. Miller, I understand your concern, but Luna's situation is complicated. We've tried everything. Multiple attempts at pack integration, enrichment activities, different feeding schedules. Nothing's worked." He pulled out a thick folder. "After her pack died, she rejected every social opportunity. We even brought in wolf behavioral specialists. The reality is, maintaining her enclosure costs the zoo significant resources, and visitor interest has dropped to almost nothing." Sophie leaned forward. "What if we tried a different approach, a gradual rehabilitation program, starting with simple interactions and building up to—" "Ms. Miller," Mr. Randall interrupted gently, "Luna hasn't responded to enrichment activities in years. She's refused contact with other wolves, destroyed enrichment toys, and shown no interest in human interaction until your recent visits." "But that's exactly my point," Sophie insisted. "She's showing signs of change. I've seen it." Mr. Randall shook his head. "Temporary responses don't indicate lasting improvement. We can't justify the expense and resources for what might be just a momentary connection." Sophie felt her chest tighten with frustration as she gathered her materials. The meeting clearly wasn't going as she'd hoped. She thanked Mr. Randall and left his office, her steps quick and determined. As she passed Luna's enclosure on her way out, she stopped. Luna was there at the edge, watching her with alert eyes and slightly perked ears. The wolf's gaze held steady, showing none of the disinterest Mr. Randall had described. Sophie placed her hand against the glass, and Luna didn't retreat. In that moment, Sophie knew she couldn't give up. The spark of connection was there. She just had to find a way to prove it to everyone else. The evening sun cast long shadows across the zoo's empty pathways as Sophie and Ellie followed Emily toward Luna's enclosure. Their footsteps echoed in the unusual quiet, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle from a nocturnal exhibit. "It's kind of spooky without all the people," Ellie whispered, holding Sophie's hand tighter. Emily smiled. "The animals are actually more relaxed at this hour. They act more naturally when there aren't crowds watching them." They reached Luna's enclosure, where the wolf was already alert to their presence. The security lights cast a soft glow over her silver-gray fur as she watched them approach. Sophie settled cross-legged on the ground near the glass, with Ellie sitting beside her. She began to hum the familiar lullaby, her voice carrying clearly in the evening stillness. Luna started pacing along the edge of her enclosure, her steps measured and deliberate. "That's interesting," Emily said quietly, jotting something in her notebook. "I've never seen her this active in the evening. Usually she just lies in her corner."
The wolf moved back and forth, her ears focused on Sophie's humming. Then it from Sophie and sat down, her amber eyes fixed intently on her former caretaker.
Sophie reached into her bag with slow, careful movements. "I brought something that might help," she whispered. She pulled out a soft blue scarf, one she'd worn for the past few days to transfer her scent. "Scent familiarization," Emily noted approvingly. "That's a smart approach." Sophie placed the scarf against the glass. Luna's nose twitched, and she took a few steps forward, her curiosity evident in her alert posture. She approached the glass cautiously, sniffing the air where the scarf rested. After a moment, she backed away slightly, maintaining a watchful distance. "Mom, look!" Ellie whispered excitedly. She's interested. As Sophie gathered her things and prepared to leave, a sound stopped her in her tracks. A soft, high-pitched whine came from Luna's enclosure. The sound transported Sophie back 15 years to nights spent comforting a frightened wolf pup who would whine for attention until Sophie sang her to sleep. Sophie's eyes met Luna's, and in that moment, she felt the old connection spark between them. The wolf's gaze held recognition, need, and something that looked almost like hope. Sophie knew then that she wouldn't stop fighting for Luna, no matter what obstacles stood in her way. Sophie and Ellie pushed open the door of the Riverside Cafe, a cozy spot just blocks from the zoo. The bell chimed above them as they entered, and Sophie immediately spotted George at a corner table, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming coffee mug. Sophie Miller, all grown up. George stood, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. And this must be Ellie. They settled into their seats, and George's face lit up with memories. You know, I remember when Luna first arrived at the zoo. Tiny little thing, but fierce. Your mother, he said, nodding to Ellie, spent every free moment with her. What was she like with the other wolves? Sophie asked, leaning forward. George smiled, stirring his coffee. Natural leader, that one. When we integrated her into the pack, she took to it like she'd been born for it. The younger wolves especially. She'd watch over them during feeding time, make sure they got their share. As George continued, describing Luna's development into a strong pack member, Sophie felt a familiar ache in her chest. The memory of the disease outbreak that had devastated the wolf pack was still raw, even after all these years. The interesting thing about Luna, George continued, his voice softening, was how she looked after the weaker ones. We had this older wolf, limping from an old injury. Luna would always hang back, keep pace with her during pack activities. Never left anyone behind. Sophie's hands tightened around her cup as George described the outbreak. It hit so fast, he said, shaking his head. Luna was the strongest one, survived it all, but after losing her pack. His voice trailed off. The conversation shifted something in Sophie's perspective. She'd been trying to reconnect with Luna by recreating their past relationship, but maybe that wasn't the right approach. Luna's nurturing instincts had been a core part of her personality. Perhaps that was the key. That afternoon, Sophie returned to the zoo with a fresh notebook. She positioned herself near Luna's enclosure and began taking detailed notes. Luna's behavior showed subtle but significant changes. Her pacing had decreased, replaced by more purposeful movements. When Sophie spoke, Luna's ears would turn toward her voice consistently now, and she spent more time near the front of the enclosure. Sophie documented each small victory. Luna investigating a new enrichment toy Emily had left, showing interest in the birds that landed near her enclosure, and maintaining eye contact for longer periods. These observations would form the foundation of her rehabilitation plan, one that would honor Luna's natural instincts as a protector and leader. That evening, Sophie sat cross-legged on her living room floor, spreading out her notes and photographs across the coffee table. Old images of Luna as a playful pup contrasted sharply with her recent observations. Beside her, Ellie lay on her stomach, colored pencils scattered around her as she carefully sketched Luna's profile. "Mom," Ellie paused her drawing, rolling onto her side. "How come you stopped working with animals? You seem so happy when we're at the zoo." The question caught Sophie off guard. She set down the notebook she'd been reviewing, her stomach tightening with familiar guilt. The bright colors of her framed photography work hung on the walls around them, beautiful wildlife shots that had built her career, but somehow left an empty space in her heart. "It's complicated, sweetie," Sophie said, running her fingers along the edge of an old photo. "I loved working in conservation, but photography was becoming successful, and I thought—" She trailed off, remembering the excitement of her first major gallery showing, the thrill of seeing her work in magazines. I thought I could do more good by showing people the beauty of wildlife through my photos. But you're not happy about it? Ellie's perception sometimes startled Sophie. Sophie sighed, gathering her thoughts. I love photography, I really do. But sometimes I feel like I let animals like Luna down. If I'd stayed in conservation work, maybe I could have helped more of them directly, made more of a difference. Ellie sat up, her drawing forgotten. But you're helping Luna now, aren't you? That's making a difference. Her eyes were earnest, full of childlike wisdom. And look at all these notes you're taking. You're doing important stuff right now. Sophie felt something warm bloom in her chest at her daughter's words. Ellie was right. The past couldn't be changed, but she could act now. The scattered notes on the table suddenly looked less like reminders of past regrets and more like building blocks for future change. With renewed determination, Sophie opened her laptop. Her fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard as she composed an email to Mr. Randall. She detailed her observations of Luna's recent behavioral changes, noting the decreased pacing, increased engagement, and positive responses to interaction. In clear, professional language, she outlined a phased socialization plan. The proposal included gradual steps, starting with increased enrichment activities and building toward carefully managed interactions with other wolves. She emphasized Luna's history as a pack leader and protector, suggesting ways to tap into these natural instincts. Sophie's hand hovered over the mouse, her cursor resting on the send button. Her heart beat faster as she reread the email one final time. This could be the moment that changed everything for Luna, or it could be another closed door. Taking a deep breath, she clicked send. Sophie's phone buzzed during breakfast the next day, and her hands trembled as she read Mr. Randall's email. Her proposed rehabilitation plan for Luna had been approved, with conditions. The trial period would last only a few weeks, and if Luna didn't show measurable improvement, the transfer to the sanctuary would proceed as planned. Results must be documented and significant, Mr. Randall's email stated firmly. We'll need to see clear evidence of positive behavioral changes. Sophie read the message 3 times, her coffee growing cold beside her. The opportunity she'd hoped for had arrived, but the pressure of the deadline made her stomach knot. Ellie, she called up the stairs. Come down here, sweetie. I have news. Ellie bounded down the stairs, her school backpack already on her shoulders. Her eyes widened as Sophie shared Mr. Randall's response. That's amazing, Mom. Luna's going to be so happy. Ellie hugged her mother tightly, but pulled back when she noticed Sophie's tense expression. What's wrong? Isn't this what you wanted? Sophie forced a smile. Of course it is. It's just... She sank into a kitchen chair. I haven't done this kind of work in so long. What if I'm not good enough anymore? What if I make things worse? But you know Luna, Ellie insisted, and she remembers you. We've seen it. Sophie nodded, drawing strength from her daughter's unwavering confidence. She spent the morning gathering supplies, including an old rubber ball similar to one Luna had loved as a pup. Her hands shook slightly as she packed her bag, but she kept reminding herself of the small victories they'd already achieved. At the zoo, Sophie approached Luna's enclosure with measured steps. The wolf lay in her usual spot, but her ears perked up at Sophie's arrival. Sophie took out the rubber ball, its bright blue surface still new and shiny. Remember these, Luna? Sophie spoke softly, showing Luna the ball before tossing it gently into the enclosure. It bounced once and rolled to a stop several feet from where Luna rested. Luna didn't move, her eyes fixed on Sophie rather than the toy. Sophie began to hum the familiar lullaby, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. Minutes passed, and Sophie continued humming, trying to ignore the doubt creeping into her thoughts. Then, Almost imperceptibly, Luna shifted. She lifted her head, her gaze moving to the ball. With careful steps, she approached it, her nose twitching as she caught its scent. Sophie held her breath as Luna stretched her neck, sniffing the toy cautiously. After what seemed like ages, Luna nudged the ball with her nose. It rolled slightly, and Luna took a quick step back before approaching again. This time, she gave it another, firmer nudge. Sophie's heart soared at this small but significant interaction. It wasn't much, just a few moments of curiosity, but it was more interest than Luna had shown in any enrichment item in years. Over the next few days, Sophie settled into a routine at the zoo. Each morning she arrived with a new enrichment item tucked into her bag, hope rising in her chest. She carefully documented Luna's reactions in a notebook, but the results weren't what she'd hoped for. On Thursday, she brought a puzzle feeder, a hollow cylinder with holes that would release treats when manipulated correctly. Emily helped her place it in Luna's enclosure, filled with the wolf's favorite snacks. Luna used to love problem-solving, Sophie explained, watching the wolf through the glass. But Luna remained in her corner, barely glancing at the new object. Hours passed, and the puzzle feeder sat untouched. Sophie's shoulders slumped as she made another note in her journal. Emily patted her arm sympathetically. "These things take time," she said, but Sophie could hear the doubt in her voice. That evening, Sophie sat on the bench outside Luna's enclosure, her failed enrichment attempts weighing heavily on her mind. She thought about the deadline looming ahead and her promise to help Luna. Maybe she was going about this all wrong. Taking a deep breath, Sophie put away her notebook and supplies. Instead of introducing new items or activities, she simply sat quietly, remembering how she and Luna used to spend peaceful afternoons together years ago. No expectations, no pressure, just presence. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the enclosure. Sophie hummed softly, not directing the sound at Luna, just letting it float in the air between them. To her surprise, Luna stirred from her corner. The wolf moved slowly, deliberately, until she reached the front of the enclosure. There, she settled down near the glass, closer to Sophie than she'd been in years. Sophie's heart swelled, but she maintained her calm demeanor, continuing to hum quietly. Luna's eyes drooped slightly, not sleeping, but relaxed. It was a small moment, but it felt more significant than any of the planned enrichment activities. When Sophie arrived home that evening, fatigue settled deep in her bones. She sank into the couch, closing her eyes for just a moment. The sound of paper rustling made her look up. Ellie sat at the coffee table, colored pencils scattered around her. She held up a drawing. Luna stood in her enclosure, but she wasn't alone. Two smaller wolves played nearby, their fur rendered in careful detail. "Remember when you told me about the orphan pups that used to live at the zoo?" Ellie asked, pushing the drawing toward her mother. "You said Luna was always so gentle with them." Sophie picked up the drawing, studying the way Ellie had captured Luna's protective stance over the younger wolves. Something clicked in her mind, a new approach that might work better than all the toys and puzzles combined. Luna didn't need more things. She needed purpose. Sophie arrived at the zoo early the next morning, her proposal tucked neatly in a folder. Her hands trembled slightly as she made her way to the staff meeting room, where Emily and other keepers were already gathered around the long table. Mr. Randall sat at the head, his expression neutral as Sophie began her presentation. She spread out her documentation, photos of Luna's recent progress, notes on her behavior, and most importantly, records from years ago showing Luna's interactions with younger wolves. Luna was always a natural leader, Sophie explained, pointing to an old photograph. But more than that, she had amazing maternal instincts. Even as a young wolf, she looked after weaker pack members. Emily nodded in agreement, but other staff members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Dr. Martinez, the zoo's veterinarian, cleared his throat. Luna hasn't interacted with other wolves in years. We can't predict how she'll react to the pups. She could become aggressive, another keeper added. Those pups are already traumatized from losing their mother. We can't risk their safety. Sophie took a deep breath. I understand your concerns, but look at these recent observations. She pulled out her notebook. Luna's showing signs of her old self, the way she responds to presence now, how she's starting to engage again. The room erupted in debate. Some staff members supported the idea, citing successful rehabilitation cases from other zoos. Others remained firmly opposed, worried about the risks. Mr. Randall listened quietly, his fingers drumming on the table. When the arguments finally died down, he spoke. This is a significant risk, Sophie. If anything goes wrong with those pups, it won't just affect Luna's future here, it could damage the zoo's reputation. I know, Sophie said quietly. But sometimes the biggest risks bring the greatest rewards. After what felt like hours, Mr. Randall sighed. We'll try one controlled introduction. The pups will remain in their separate enclosure with only a mesh barrier between them and Luna. At the first sign of aggression, we end it immediately. That evening, Sophie sat cross-legged in front of Luna's enclosure. The wolf had moved closer than usual, her ears perked forward as Sophie spoke softly. We're going to try something new, Sophie whispered, watching Luna's golden eyes track her movements. I think you remember what it's like to be part of a family, to have others depending on you. Luna tilted her head slightly, and though Sophie knew the wolf couldn't understand her words, she felt a connection in that moment, a shared hope for something better. As the sun set behind them, casting long shadows across the enclosure, Sophie watched Luna settle comfortably near the glass, her gaze steady and alert. The morning air felt crisp and cool as Sophie arrived at the zoo the next day. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she watched the keepers prepare the neutral enclosure. Emily moved efficiently, checking the mesh barriers and clearing away any potential hazards. Everything's secure, Emily assured Sophie, giving the barrier one final tug. We've created enough space on both sides so neither Luna nor the pups will feel trapped. Sophie nodded, unable to find her voice. She stood back as the keepers began Luna's transfer. The wolf emerged from her transport crate cautiously, her silver coat catching the morning light. Luna's ears swiveled in all directions, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Her muscles were tense, but her movements remained controlled as she explored the space. So far, so good, Emily whispered, making notes on her clipboard. The real test came moments later. 2 keepers appeared with the wolf pups in separate carriers. The young wolves tumbled out eagerly, their dark fur bouncing as they bounded around their side of the enclosure. Their tails wagged with endless enthusiasm as they discovered every corner of their new space. Luna's reaction was immediate. A low growl rumbled in her throat, and she backed away from the barrier. Sophie's fingers curled into fists at her sides, her breath catching. Mr. Randall stepped forward, ready to call off the introduction. Then one of the pups let out a high-pitched howl, followed by its sibling. The sound echoed through the enclosure, and Luna froze mid-step. Her ears shot forward, and her growl faded into silence. Everyone watched as she tilted her head, listening intently to the pups' calls. Sophie hardly dared to breathe as Luna took one tentative step toward the barrier, then another. The older wolf's nose twitched as she caught the pup's scent. When she reached the mesh, she pressed her nose close, inhaling deeply. A soft whine escaped her throat, not threatening, but almost questioning. The pups rushed to the barrier, tails still wagging. Luna didn't retreat this time. Instead, She stayed where she was, watching them with intense focus. Her posture remained alert, but no longer showed signs of aggression. "Look at that," Emily whispered, her voice full of wonder. "She's choosing to stay near them." Time seemed to slow as Luna settled herself on the ground, maintaining her position near the barrier. The pups mimicked her, flopping down on their side, occasionally pawing playfully at each other while stealing glances at the older wolf. When the session's time limit arrived, Sophie felt tears of relief in her eyes. Not only had Luna tolerated the pup's presence, but she'd shown genuine interest. It wasn't the immediate connection she'd hoped for in her wildest dreams, but it was far better than anyone had expected. As the keepers began the process of returning the animals to their regular enclosures, Sophie watched Luna take one last look at the pups before walking calmly into her transport crate. For the first time in weeks, hope felt like more than just a wish. It felt real. The next morning's sunlight had barely touched the zoo grounds when Sophie arrived, her notebook tucked under her arm. She made her way straight to Luna's enclosure, where she found the wolf already awake and moving with unusual purpose. Luna padded back and forth along the edge where yesterday's introduction had taken place. Her nose pressed against the ground repeatedly, gathering sense from the previous day's encounter. Sophie watched in amazement as Luna lifted her head, ears forward, and moved with a lightness she hadn't shown in weeks. "She's been like that since sunrise," Emily said, appearing beside Sophie. "It's the most active we've seen her in months." Sophie scribbled quick notes about Luna's behavior, documenting every sniff, pause, and change in posture. "She keeps returning to where the pups' scent is strongest," she observed. In Mr. Randall's office, the morning light streamed through Venetian blinds as they discussed the next phase. Emily spread out her observation sheets across his desk, while Sophie shared her morning notes. "The initial signs are promising," Mr. Randall admitted, adjusting his glasses. "But we need to maintain strict safety protocols." "What if we gradually reduce the barrier space?" Emily suggested. "We could start by letting them get closer while still maintaining separation." Sophie nodded eagerly. "Luna's body language shows curiosity rather than aggression. I think she's ready for closer contact." Mr. Randall drummed his fingers on the desk before agreeing. 3 more supervised sessions with the current setup. If those go well, we'll consider reducing the barrier distance. Throughout the afternoon, Sophie sat near Luna's enclosure, recording every detail of the wolf's behavior. Gone was the listless pacing that had characterized Luna's days. Instead, she moved with purpose, investigating different areas of her enclosure as if seeing them anew. When other animals made sounds, Luna's ears would perk up immediately. She seemed especially attentive to the higher-pitched calls of younger animals. Sophie noted how Luna would pause her exploration to listen, her head tilting in concentration. As the day drew to a close, Sophie gathered her belongings. Movement caught her eye, and she looked up to find Luna standing at the edge of her enclosure. The wolf's gaze was steady, focused entirely on Sophie. There was an expectancy in Luna's posture, as if she were waiting for something to happen. Sophie recognized the look. It was the same alertness Luna had shown as a pup before their training sessions. The wolf's renewed engagement touched something deep in Sophie's heart. But she reminded herself to stay patient. This was just the beginning of a long journey. The morning sun shone bright across the neutral enclosure as the zoo staff prepared for the second session. Sophie stood behind the observation window, her heart racing as Emily and another keeper lowered part of the barrier that separated Luna from the wolf pups. Luna's ears twitched at the mechanical sound of the barrier moving. She remained in her corner, watching intently as the 2 gray pups came into view. Their small bodies wiggled with excitement as they caught sight of her. "Easy now," Sophie whispered, though she knew they couldn't hear her through the glass. The pups bounded forward, their paws pattering against the ground. Luna's posture stiffened, and a low growl rumbled in her throat when they got within a few feet. The sound wasn't aggressive, but it was enough to make Emily reach for the emergency barrier control. Then something remarkable happened. The smaller of the two pups stopped, dropped to the ground, and rolled onto its back, exposing its belly in a classic submissive gesture. Its little paws waved in the air as it wiggled on its back, looking up at Luna with bright eyes. Luna's growl faded. She took a tentative step forward, then another. Sophie held her breath as Luna lowered her head to sniff the exposed belly of the pup. The contact was gentle, just a soft touch of her nose against the pup's fur. The second pup, watching its sibling, quickly mimicked the behavior. It flopped onto its back next to its littermate, tail wagging hopefully. Luna's attention shifted between the two pups, her movements becoming more fluid and natural. What happened next brought tears to Sophie's eyes. Luna began to circle the pups, her body language shifting from uncertain to protective. She moved with purpose, creating a boundary around them as if checking for threats, just as she had done years ago with her original pack. Sophie's hands shook as she documented everything in her notebook. Her vision blurred with tears, but she forced herself to keep writing. This was the breakthrough they'd been hoping for, the first real sign that Luna might accept these pups as her new family. Emily touched Sophie's shoulder gently. "This is amazing progress," she whispered. "But remember, we still have a long way to go." Sophie nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She knew Emily was right. This beautiful moment was just the beginning, and they would need to proceed carefully to maintain this delicate progress. The morning light filtered through the trees as Sophie watched the zookeepers prepare for the third introduction session. This time, there were no barriers between Luna and the pups. Emily stood ready with a tranquilizer gun, just in case, while other staff members positioned themselves strategically around the enclosure. Luna's initial body language seemed positive. She stood tall but relaxed, her tail held horizontally as the pups entered the space. The smaller pup immediately dropped into a submissive pose, while its more energetic sibling bounced around excitedly. For a few minutes, everything went smoothly. Then the active pup, caught up in its playful mood, darted behind Luna and nipped at her tail. The change was instant. Luna whirled around with a snarl, teeth bared, her whole body rigid with tension. The pup yelped in surprise, scrambling backward. "Get them out!" Emily shouted. The staff rushed in with catch poles and protective shields, quickly separating Luna from the pups. Sophie's heart sank as she watched the pups being hurried to safety, while Luna paced and growled. Back in her regular enclosure, Luna continued to show signs of agitation. Sophie sat on the bench nearby, her shoulders slumped. "I pushed too hard," she whispered to Emily, who had joined her. "Give her time," Emily advised gently. "We can't rush this process." Sophie spent the remainder of the day by Luna's enclosure, speaking in soft, soothing tones. She observed how Luna would pace restlessly, then stop to look in the direction where the pups had been. Sometimes she would whine, a sound that seemed more confused than aggressive. "You're trying to figure this out too, aren't you?" Sophie murmured, watching Luna's conflicted behavior. That evening, Sophie sat at her kitchen table surrounded by notebooks and her laptop. She replayed videos of Luna's interactions with the pups, comparing them with footage from years ago, when Luna was with her original pack. She noticed something significant. Luna's aggressive response wasn't the same as her territorial displays from her years in isolation. Instead, it resembled the corrective behavior she used to show toward younger pack members who stepped out of line. Sophie's eyes widened as she made detailed notes. This wasn't a rejection. It was Luna attempting to establish boundaries, just as she would have done as a pack leader. She had reacted strongly, not because she wanted to hurt the pup, but because she didn't know how else to communicate her discomfort. "We need to try again," Sophie whispered to herself, "but differently." She began sketching out a new plan for more structured interactions, ones that would help Luna feel more secure in her role as the adult wolf while giving the pups clear boundaries to respect. The morning sun cast long shadows across the specially prepared enclosure as Sophie and the zoo staff implemented their new approach. Emily positioned herself near the entrance, tranquilizer gun holstered but ready, while other keepers stood at strategic points around the perimeter. Sophie's heart pounded as she watched Luna explore the modified space. "Let's bring in the first pup," Emily called softly. The smaller of the two wolf pups entered the enclosure, its movements deliberate and slow. Luna's ears twitched forward, but she maintained her position, watching intently. The pup kept its head low, occasionally glancing up at Luna while maintaining a respectful distance. Luna's tail shifted from rigid to slightly relaxed. A soft whine escaped her throat, not threatening, but inviting. The pup's ears perked up at the sound, and it took a tentative step closer. Sophie held her breath, clipboard pressed against her chest. This was exactly what they'd hoped for, Luna setting the pace of the interaction. When the second pup was brought in, everything changed. Perhaps feeling lonely or scared, it lifted its head and released a mournful howl that echoed through the enclosure. The sound seemed to strike something deep within Luna. She stood perfectly still, ears erect, muscles tense. Then, as if awakening from a long sleep, Luna tilted her head back. Her throat trembled, and a powerful howl burst forth, her first in years. The sound carried all the loneliness and loss she'd endured, but also something else: hope. The pups joined in immediately, their higher-pitched voices weaving with Luna's deeper tones in an ancient chorus. Sophie felt tears streaming down her face as she watched the transformation taking place before her. Emily grabbed her hand, squeezing it tight. Luna moved toward the pups with newfound purpose. Her steps were gentle, deliberate. When she reached them, she lowered her head and nuzzled each one softly, her tail swaying in a relaxed arc. The pups responded with tiny licks and wagging tails of their own. With fluid grace, Luna settled onto the ground. The pups hesitated for just a moment before curling up beside her, their small bodies pressing against her warm fur. Luna's posture remained relaxed, her eyes alert but peaceful as she watched over her new charges. Sophie wiped her eyes, watching the scene unfold. Luna's entire demeanor had changed. Gone was the isolated, withdrawn wolf who had spent years in the corner of her enclosure. In her place lay a protector, a leader, a mother figure who had finally found her purpose again. Sophie arrived at the zoo just as the morning mist was lifting from the grounds. Her footsteps echoed through the quiet pathways as she made her way to Luna's enclosure, her camera bag slung over her shoulder. The sight that greeted her made her pause mid-step. Luna lay stretched out near the glass, her gray fur catching the early sunlight. The two pups tumbled and wrestled nearby, their playful yips filling the morning air. Every few moments they would glance at Luna, as if checking that she was still watching over them. Each time they looked, Luna's ears would twitch in acknowledgement. "I've never seen anything like it," Emily whispered, appearing beside Sophie. "She's been like this since we opened up this morning." During the scheduled introduction session, Luna's transformation became even more apparent. As the pups bounded around her, she lifted her head and watched them with alert interest. When one pup darted forward to nip at her leg, Luna responded with a gentle growl that held no real warning, just playful encouragement. The bolder of the two pups, growing braver by the minute, attempted to scramble onto Luna's back. Sophie tensed, but Luna remained calm. She allowed the pup to balance there for a few seconds before giving a gentle shake that sent the little one tumbling softly into the grass. "Look at that," Mr. Randall murmured, shaking his head in amazement. "A week ago, we were ready to transfer her to a sanctuary." Sophie nodded but kept her eyes fixed on Luna, noting every interaction in her notebook. "We still need to be careful," she reminded them. "This is all very new for her." As the afternoon wore on, Luna's maternal instincts became increasingly evident. When the pups' play grew too rough, with one pouncing hard on its sibling, Luna rose from her spot. With careful movements, she approached the tumbling pair and nudged them apart with her nose, separating them before the play could escalate further. Later that evening, Sophie sat in the zoo's office, reviewing the day's footage on her laptop. She replayed the moment of Luna's intervention several times, studying the wolf's body language. There was no aggression in Luna's movements, only the confident authority of a pack leader keeping order. It was exactly what Sophie had hoped to see. Luna wasn't just tolerating the pups, she was actively guiding them. The video showed Luna settling back down after separating the pups, watching as they resumed their play with slightly calmer energy. Her posture was relaxed but alert, every inch the protective guardian she was meant to be. Sophie felt tears welling up in her eyes as she watched. After years of isolation, Luna was finally embracing her role as a leader again. It was more than just progress, it was a transformation. The morning sun filtered through the windows of the zoo's conference room as Sophie sat with Emily, Mr. Randall, and the other zookeepers. Charts and behavior logs spread across the table showed Luna's remarkable progress over the past weeks. Her interactions with the pups have been consistently positive, Emily said, pointing to a graph. "We think it's time to reduce direct supervision." Mr. Randall nodded. The constant human presence might be holding back their natural pack dynamics. Sophie twisted her hands in her lap. "I understand. But are we sure she's ready? Luna's still learning to trust her instincts again." "That's exactly why we need to step back," Emily explained gently. "She needs space to develop those leadership skills on her own." They agreed to begin with short periods of minimal supervision, using only the security cameras to monitor the pack's interactions. Sophie found herself pacing outside the observation room later that afternoon, watching the screens intently. The pups were engaged in their usual rough-and-tumble play, chasing each other around Luna, who lay in her favorite sunny spot. Suddenly, one of the pups let out a sharp yelp. He had caught his paw between two rocks while running, and now he lay on his side, whimpering softly. Luna's head snapped up at the sound. She rose quickly, circling the injured pup with worried steps. Her whines echoed through the speakers as she moved around him, clearly distressed but unsure how to help. The pup continued to whimper, holding his paw off the ground. Sophie pressed her hands against the observation window, her heart racing. "Come on, Luna," she whispered. "You know what to do." Luna stopped her pacing and stood still, looking down at the injured pup. Her ears flicked back and forth as she processed the situation. The other pup sat nearby, watching quietly. For several long moments, Luna seemed frozen between action and retreat. Then slowly, she lowered her head and began to gently lick the injured pup's paw. Her movements were careful and deliberate, cleaning the area with maternal attention. The pup's whimpers gradually subsided as Luna continued her ministrations. Emily touched Sophie's shoulder. "Look at that. Her maternal instincts are definitely there. She just needed time to remember them." Mr. Randall made notes on his clipboard. "She's still hesitant, but this is exactly the kind of caregiving behavior we hope to see. We'll need to continue supporting these instincts, but this is very promising." The staff watched as Luna settled down beside the injured pup, keeping him close while he rested. Her actions were measured and careful, showing both progress and the remaining uncertainty in her new role. The zoo's decision to showcase Luna's progress came with mixed emotions for Sophie. She stood in Mr. Randall's office, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "We understand your concerns," Mr. Randall said, adjusting his glasses. "But Luna's story could inspire so many people. We'll keep the crowd small and controlled," Emily added. "Plus, the donations could help fund more rehabilitation programs like hers." Sophie watched Luna through the office window. The wolf was lying in the grass while the pups playfully tugged at her tail. "Okay," she finally agreed. "But at the first sign of stress, we end it." On the morning of the event, the zoo buzzed with quiet excitement. A small group of visitors gathered near Luna's enclosure, speaking in hushed tones. Children pressed their faces against the glass, wide-eyed and eager. Sophie's stomach churned as Emily opened the door to the den area. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, one of the pups bounded out, followed quickly by its sibling. Luna emerged more slowly, her ears perked and alert at the sight of the crowd. The pups, seemingly oblivious to their audience, began their usual play routine, chasing and wrestling near the front of the enclosure. Luna stood rigid, her eyes scanning the gathered faces. Sophie held her breath. Gradually, as the pups ventured further from the den, Luna began to move. She followed them with measured steps, keeping herself between the crowd and her charges. When one of the more adventurous pups strayed too close to the far corner, Luna moved with surprising grace, using her body to guide it back toward its sibling. The crowd murmured in appreciation. A little girl tugged on her mother's sleeve, pointing excitedly as Luna nuzzled the pup back to safety. "Look how gentle she is," someone whispered. "I can't believe this is the same wolf who was all alone last month," another visitor remarked. After the demonstration, Sophie lingered near the back of the dispersing crowd, listening to their reactions. Two teenagers stopped to read Luna's story posted on the enclosure wall, their faces softening with empathy. "That's amazing," one said. "I never knew wolves could heal like that." An elderly couple paused beside Sophie. "Such a beautiful reminder," the woman said, "that it's never too late for second chances." That evening, Sophie sat at her desk at home, her laptop open to a blank document. The words "Wolf Education and Conservation Program" topped the page as she began to outline her proposal, Luna's success story at its heart. The next day, Sophie watched from the observation deck as Emily and the other zookeepers scattered treats throughout Luna's enclosure. They carefully created scent trails using diluted meat extracts, weaving paths between rocks and fallen logs. The morning sun cast long shadows across the space, and a cool breeze carried the enticing smells through the air. "Ready?" Emily called up to Sophie, giving a thumbs up. Sophie nodded, adjusting her camera to capture what she hoped would be a breakthrough moment. When the staff released Luna and the pups into the enriched area, the young wolves immediately bounded forward, their noses twitching excitedly. Luna hung back, her tail low and ears perked, watching as the pups scattered in different directions without any real strategy. "Come on, Luna," Sophie whispered. "Show them how it's done." The pups' excited yips echoed through the enclosure as they ran circles, missing obvious clues. Luna's posture changed slowly, her head lifted, and her stance became more alert. She padded forward, nose to the ground, following one of the stronger scent trails. When she found the first hidden treat in a puzzle box, she didn't eat it. Instead, she waited, watching the pups with increasing interest. One of the pups noticed and trotted over, tail wagging. Luna gently nudged the young wolf toward the box, demonstrating how to paw it open. "Look at that," Emily whispered, joining Sophie on the deck. "She's teaching them." Luna's confidence seemed to grow with each successful find. She began actively herding the pups toward promising areas, using soft grunts to get their attention. When one pup struggled with a particularly tricky hiding spot, Luna demonstrated the solution, carefully pushing aside a branch to reveal the treat beneath. The transformation was remarkable. The wolf who had spent years in isolation was now moving with purpose, her body language expressing patience and authority as she guided her young charges. She corrected their mistakes with gentle nudges and encouraged their successes with subtle signs of approval. Sophie captured it all on camera, but found herself lowering the lens more often than not, simply watching in awe. Luna's journey from a withdrawn, lonely wolf to this confident leader struck a deep chord. Like Luna, Sophie had struggled with doubt and loss of purpose. Seeing Luna embrace her natural role as a teacher and protector brought tears to her eyes. As the morning drew to a close, Luna gathered the pups with soft woofs, leading them back toward their den. She paused at the entrance, waiting until both pups had safely entered before following them inside. The scene perfectly captured everything Sophie had hoped for when she first proposed bringing the pups to Luna. Not just companionship, but a renewed sense of purpose and belonging. Sophie arrived at the zoo early the next morning, her camera bag slung over her shoulder. The sound of playful yips drew her attention to Luna's enclosure, where the pups were chasing each other through patches of morning sunlight. Luna lay in the shade of an overhanging rock, her watchful eyes following their every move. "They're really thriving together," Emily said, appearing beside Sophie. "Luna's been so consistent with them. Mr. Randall thinks it's time to move them to the larger habitat." Sophie's heart leaped. The new enclosure was 3 times the size of Luna's current space, with natural features that would give the pack room to truly bond and grow. "When?" "Today, if you'd like to help. We've been letting them explore it in sections over the past week, but now we're ready for the full transition." The morning passed in a flurry of activity as Sophie joined the zoo staff in preparing the new habitat. They scattered familiar toys and bedding throughout the space, creating scent markers that would help Luna and the pups feel secure. The enclosure stretched out before them, filled with towering pines, rocky outcrops, and a crystal-clear pond fed by a gentle stream. When they finally opened the connecting gate, Luna emerged first, her steps measured and deliberate. She moved slowly along the perimeter, stopping frequently to mark territory and assess potential den sites. The pups bounded after her, their excitement contained only by Luna's occasional warning growls when they strayed too far. Sophie watched from the observation platform as Luna guided the pups through their new home. The older wolf seemed to grow more confident with each passing hour. Her tail held higher as she led her charges to the pond for a drink. One of the pups splashed playfully in the shallow water, and Luna didn't hesitate to wade in after it, demonstrating how to navigate the new feature safely. By late afternoon, Luna had chosen a den site beneath an overhanging rock formation sheltered by thick brush. She herded the tired pups inside, emerging moments later to stand guard at the entrance. Her posture was relaxed but alert, the stance of a wolf truly at home in her territory. "I think we can call this a success," Emily said softly, joining Sophie at the railing. "Look at how natural she is with them now. It's like she was never alone." Sophie nodded, overcome with emotion as she watched Luna settle into her new role and home. The transformation from the isolated, withdrawn wolf she'd first rediscovered to this confident pack leader seemed almost miraculous. Yet Sophie had witnessed every small step, every tiny victory that had led to this moment. 3 weeks after moving to the new habitat, Sophie arrived at the zoo to find Emily and the other zookeepers setting up an intricate series of food puzzles throughout the enclosure. These weren't the simple enrichment toys Luna and the pups had mastered before. These new challenges required genuine teamwork to solve. "We've hidden high-value treats inside these containers," Emily explained, pointing to a wooden box with multiple sliding panels. They'll need to work together to access them. One wolf needs to hold down this lever, while another slides the panel. Sophie watched nervously as the staff finished their preparations. When they released Luna and the pups into the test area, the young wolves immediately caught the scent of the hidden treats. They bounded forward excitedly, pawing at the puzzles without coordination. The first attempt was chaos. Both pups tried to grab the same lever, growling and pushing each other aside. Luna observed from a short distance, her ears twitching as she assessed the situation. When one pup snapped at his brother, Luna intervened with a firm but gentle growl. She approached the puzzle box herself, demonstrating how to press down the lever with her paw. Then she stepped back, watching expectantly. One of the pups mimicked her action, holding the lever down just as she had shown. Luna nudged the other pup toward the sliding panel, encouraging him to complete the second part of the task. "Look at that," Emily whispered. "She's actually teaching them to take turns." The pups caught on quickly under Luna's guidance. When they successfully opened the first box, Luna let them share the treats while she watched proudly. As they moved to the next puzzle, the pups fell into a natural rhythm, one holding, one sliding, then switching roles for the next challenge. Sophie captured photos as the pack worked their way through each station. Luna's body language showed confidence and patience, stepping in only when needed to redirect or demonstrate. The pups' initial competition had transformed into genuine cooperation, their tails wagging as they solved each puzzle together. The final test was the most complex, a large structure requiring all three wolves to work in unison. Luna positioned herself at the central lever while guiding each pup to their stations, with gentle nudges and quiet woofs. Working as one unit, they successfully released the largest cache of treats. When the challenge was complete, Luna led the tired but satisfied pups to a shady spot beneath a pine tree. They collapsed together in a contented heap, the pups snuggling close to their surrogate mother as she groomed their fur. Sophie captured several shots of this peaceful moment, knowing they perfectly illustrated the success of Luna's journey from isolation to leadership. "I think we can officially call this rehabilitation complete," Emily said, smiling as she watched the family bond. "Luna's not just surviving anymore. She's thriving as a pack leader." The setting sun cast long shadows across the zoo paths as Sophie settled onto her familiar bench near Luna's habitat. This would be her last evening here before heading to Africa for a 3-month wildlife photography assignment. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the distant sounds of other animals preparing for night. Luna's new enclosure stretched out before her, filled with natural features that made it feel like a slice of wilderness. The two pups chased each other around a fallen log, their playful yips echoing in the evening air. Luna lay on a raised rock, her head held high as she monitored their activities. "Mom, look!" Ellie pointed excitedly. "See how Luna always keeps them in sight? She's such a good mother now." Sophie smiled, watching as Luna's ears twitched at every sound the pups made. When one strayed too close to the water's edge, Luna let out a soft warning growl, causing the pup to retreat to safer ground. "She certainly is," Sophie agreed, pulling Ellie close. Mr. Randall approached them, his hands in his pockets. "I have to admit, Sophie, I had my doubts about your plan," he said, settling beside them on the bench. "But you've given Luna a new lease on life." "Thank you for taking the chance," Sophie replied. "I hope her story helps people understand the importance of wildlife conservation. These animals are capable of so much more than we sometimes give them credit for." Mr. Randall nodded. Luna's transformation has already made an impact. Visitor numbers are up, and we've received several generous donations specifically for our wolf conservation program. People connect with her story. It gives them hope. As the sky darkened and the time for goodbye drew near, Sophie stood and walked to the glass barrier. Luna noticed her movement and descended from her perch, padding quietly to the edge of the enclosure. The wolf sat down, her amber eyes fixed steadily on Sophie. Sophie placed her hand against the cool glass, just as she had done countless times as a teenager. Tears welled in her eyes as she remembered the scared, isolated wolf she'd found months ago, and marveled at the confident pack leader Luna had become. "Goodbye, old friend," she whispered. Luna remained still, her gaze unwavering. In that moment, Sophie felt the weight of their shared journey. From Luna's playful puppyhood, through her years of isolation, to this triumphant return to life as part of a family. Though bittersweet, Sophie knew their story had come full circle. Late autumn sunlight filtered through the trees as Sophie and Ellie walked up the familiar zoo path. 3 months had passed since their last visit, and the invitation to attend Luna's special celebration event had brought them back eagerly. "Do you think they'll remember us?" Ellie asked, clutching her mother's hand. "We'll see," Sophie replied, her camera bag swinging at her side. The sounds of excited voices drew them toward Luna's habitat, where a crowd had already gathered. The habitat looked different now, enriched with new features and seasonal touches. Sophie's breath caught as she spotted Luna standing atop her favorite rock outcropping. The wolf's coat gleamed silver in the sunlight, thick and healthy for the winter season. Below her, the 2 pups, now nearly grown, practiced hunting techniques with a puzzle feeder. "Look how big they've gotten," Ellie whispered in awe. Sophie watched as Luna descended gracefully from her perch to demonstrate the proper technique for accessing the hidden treats. The younger wolves followed her lead, their movements becoming more coordinated with each try. Luna's confidence was unmistakable. Gone was any trace of the isolated, withdrawn wolf they'd first encountered. Mr. Randall's voice came over the speaker system, drawing everyone's attention to the new educational exhibit nearby. Sophie felt a flutter of emotion as she saw her photographs displayed prominently, images tracking Luna's journey from isolation to leadership. Each photo told part of the story, accompanied by educational text about wolf behavior and conservation needs. Children pressed close to the display, pointing excitedly at different images while their parents read the captions aloud. A group of school-age kids gathered around Emily as she explained wolf pack dynamics, using Luna's story as an example. "Your photos really capture her spirit," a visitor commented to Sophie, recognizing her from the exhibit's credit panel. "It's amazing to see how far she's come." Sophie nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat as she watched Luna guide her pack through their afternoon routine. The wolf moved with purpose now, her steps sure and strong. When one of the younger wolves became overexcited during play, Luna stepped in smoothly, redirecting the energy with gentle authority. As the event wound down and the crowd began to thin, Sophie and Ellie paused for one last look at the habitat. Luna was settling her pack into their evening positions, the younger wolves flanking her as they surveyed their territory. For a brief moment, the wolf's gaze met Sophie's. There was a flash of recognition, a quiet acknowledgement, before Luna turned back to her family. "She's happy now, isn't she, Mom?" Ellie asked softly. "Yes," Sophie replied, watching Luna nuzzle one of her adopted pups. "She found her way back to who she was meant to be." If you enjoyed the story of Sophie and Luna, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.